Well, as you're there, Mike, I might as well make a start on what I was going to do. Oh, evening, John. I see you've joined us. Yeah, I thought, as I've kept saying that I was in the Royal Observer Corps, I'd give a little background to the Observer Corps, as we were very much an invisible or forgotten service. So I can't promise it'll be absolutely riveting, but if you give me a minute, I just need to go and grab my notes. So, the Royal Observer Corps. This could be a part one if anyone shows any interest. But like I say, I might bore you all to tears. But I go around giving talks to probus groups, round tables, Rotary clubs, women's institutes, knitting circles, young mothers groups, you name it. I've given talks to all kinds of things. About the Observer Corps, its history, and also what we were expected to do in the course of a nuclear attack, if it had ever happened, God help us. So, I'll start with the history this evening. I'll try not to take too much time, and try not to be too boring and go off at tangents, which I tend to do. So our crest, where we're at, our crest, yeah, an Elizabethan beacon lighter, and that sort of goes back to our DNA, I could say. Oh, that disappeared there on my monitor. Yeah, an Elizabethan beacon lighter, because I suppose the first observers were introduced in 1570 by a bloke called William Brooke. Sir William Brooke. He was one of Queen Elizabeth's cronies. And at the time, the Spanish were getting a bit uppity. So he decided that we needed some kind of warning if the Spanish fleet should attack. So he designed a system of beacons, which came in good use in 1588 when the Spanish Armada came. So we have the Elizabethan beacon lighter as our crest, affectionately known by observers as Fiery Fred. And the association, which is still going today, we use Fiery Fred as our emblem, without the crest and wreath and things. So he's still with us today. But I'll move on a bit further in our history. In 1914, late 1914, we were getting attacked by German airships, and decided that the police should report these attacks to the Admiralty, so that the Admiralty could get in touch with the Royal Naval Air Service, as it was at the time, to try and shoot down these people with their airships. And the system worked quite well. It actually started around Hull, but they decided that London was more the place that needed protecting. So it was recentered on London, and then increased to a 60-mile range from London by about the end of 1914. Early 1915, it extended up as far as the Midlands, and it was just a thing where the police still had to report the airships. There were no one sort of specifically enrolled to do it, but that was to change. By the end of 1915, the whole country was covered, but 1916, the War Office took over from the Admiralty, and things pretty much plodded along like that until 1918. Yeah, it was early to mid 1918, and it was retitled and made more London-centric once again, and became known as the London Air Defence Area. So that lasted till the end of the war, and did sterling service with just policemen watching out. 1920 it was disbanded, and all quiet again. But mid-20s, there were mutterings and rumours about what was going on in Germany, and there was a committee formed for air raid defence, or air raid precautions, and they decided that the Observer Corps should be formed. So 1925, 29th of October, I've just had to check my dates for that, I knew it was October, but 1925, so our centenary in 2 years. The Observer Corps was formed by a Major General Ashmore, and it was volunteers, and they were enrolled in the police as special constables. But when you actually read through all the documents, they were special constables with no powers of arrest, and hadn't to be used for normal constabulary duties. They had specific war duties. They had annual exercises, and were shown to be quite good at tracking aircraft. Basically, they'd sit in the middle of a field with a pair of binoculars, nothing more than that. But in October 1928, the Air Ministry took over from the constabulary side of it, and all kinds of arrangements were made. They'd be given a few pounds to provide some sort of shelter where they were, and telephone lines would be run in to a telephone pole or a fence post or something where they were, and in the event of a war or something like that, somebody in the village would lose their telephone line, and it would be diverted at each end to this post in a field or to an operations room. March the 1st, 1929, we got our first Commodore, who was Air Commodore Masterman, and he's still remembered in our sort of list of venerables. But a few years later, a bloke you probably have heard of, called Hugh Tremonier Creswell Dowding, devised an air defence system that involved such things as chain home, a very early radar system. And let me see, yeah, there's a map of the chain home system. The farthermost red line is chain home, and the one nearer the coast is chain home low, and it doesn't seem very apparent from that, but it had one great failing, and that was that the chain home radar only looked out from the coast, and any aircraft that came over the coast just disappeared from the system. So it needed the Observer Corps to track them, and for that we were given an instrument, a post instrument, which sat on a round table and could turn round, and everybody thinks that it told you the height. It didn't. You had to estimate the height. And on the table was a map. So once you estimated the height, once you viewed it through the eyepiece, there was a pointer you can see just to the right of the gentleman on the left's chin, and that would tell him whereabouts on the map the aircraft was flying over. And a little later this was improved with the later type, and that is actually mine. And you'll note that there are 2 pointers, and one is attached to a thing called the Micklethwaite height corrector. And the Micklethwaite height corrector made the plotting far more accurate. It worked by triangulation. If you got a report from another monitoring post of a bearing, and you had a different bearing to him, obviously they cross at some point, and you could work out where that was, and you slid the second pointer to that place, and that gave you a corrected height, which therefore made all your subsequent plots more accurate. So people were sat with these in the fields and reporting through to filter rooms for Hugh Dowding, and it worked really, really well. In fact, in September 1938 there was a bit of a scare and everybody was called up, and telephone lines were diverted, and the observers sat in their little shelters in the middle of fields and on cliff tops, and they were there until October, and then people got their phones reconnected. But nearly a year later, 24th of August 1939, the Corps was stood to again, and they weren't stood down again till 1945. The Battle of Britain is probably where we're most famous, and there's the bit in the film, of course, with Trevor Howard. The Stukas are attacking the radars at Ventnor and Dover, and Trevor Howard famously says, "We're blind. All we've got now is the observer corps," and there are a few shots of observers at work. And in fact, one of the bits, he looks at the instrument to read off the height, and no, that's wrong. So you can bore everybody by telling them that if you see it again. But absolutely brilliant work was done by the observers back then, held in high esteem by those of us who served later on. So much so that they gained the title Royal on the 9th of April 1941 from the King. Up until that point they had just been the Observer Corps, but they were the first civilian organisation to gain the title Royal. And 1941 was a bit of a busy year, because on the 10th of May, Alpha 2 post at Embleton in Durham Group reported a Messerschmitt 110 flying west at 50 feet. And this went through the filter room, and the Air Ministry said, "No, that's rubbish. It can't be a Messerschmitt 110. It must be a Dornier 17. Messerschmitt 110 hasn't got the range." So it was passed from post to post as they've tracked it, and reports were going in. Messerschmitt 110, 50 feet, heading west. And the area supervisor for that area of Observer Corps, the area commander, was a Major Graham Donald. I get confused with him because he's got two Christian names. He was in the control room, and they were saying, your men, they can't identify aircraft, it must be a Dornier. And he said, well, look, if my men are saying it's a Messerschmitt, it's a Messerschmitt. And he decided he would take off and go and look for it himself. So got in his car, and at the same time the RAF sent out some Defiants. But the weather was a bit murky and they couldn't find it. They lost it over some forests. So Major Duncan went and he called in at a drill hall at a place called Bussy. And he heard that the plane had crashed. It had been spotted by one of the Observer Corps posts crashing, and one man had bailed out. And the bloke that had bailed out was being brought to the drill hall. So very quickly, Major Donald went in his car, picked some bits of it up, just to prove what it was, and went back to the drill hall where this very sorry-looking German was. And he started to interview him because he spoke a bit of German, and the bloke was given his name as Alfred Horn. And he wasn't very forthcoming about anything, but he wanted to see the Duke of Sutherland, which seemed a bit strange. And Major Donald had been in Germany quite a bit before the war, and he'd been to Munich, so he'd asked this chap if he knew Munich, and he said, yes, he does. And he said, well, do you know such and such a brewery? And the bloke turned his nose up at this, and he thought, well, I only know of two teetotalers in Germany. He said, one's Hitler and the other one's Rudolf Hess. And it then dawned on him that Alfred is the anglicised version of Rudolf, with Rud being German for red and Ulf being sort of Alfred. So he queried him, and he denied it. But he rang the Air Ministry and said, look, you've got Rudolf Hess here. And they said, don't worry, the Army intelligence officers are coming to interview him. So they said, okay. He said, by the way, that was a Messerschmitt 110. You couldn't pick it up with Defiance, but I've picked some of it up in an old Vauxhall. So that was the story of Rudolf Hess. And 2 days later, Major Donald got a phone call telling him that the Army intelligence officers had finally discovered that it was in fact Rudolf Hess. So that was quite a nice sort of pat on the back for the Observer Corps. September 1941, keeping us busy yet again, women were introduced. They had been in other forces, like the WAF and Wrens, before that, but September 1941, we got ladies joining us. I don't know why it took so long. Maybe it's because they thought, wasn't becoming for them being sat in the middle of a field with some strange men. Yeah. So war progressed, and 28th of April 1944, Operational Order 51, I think it was sent out by headquarters of the Observer Corps, asking for volunteers for hazardous duties. The people had to be very good at aircraft recognition, which most observers were. So 1,326 applied. 209 didn't qualify. Now, to qualify, they started showing pictures of aircraft for 2 seconds. A picture of an aircraft, 2 seconds, you had to identify it, and you had to get 99%. And they gradually speeded it up till there was a flash of part of an aircraft for 1/10 of a second. And roughly 1,100 passed at 90% at that, and 81 failed on medical. But those that got through were split into teams of 2, and they went on the defensively armed merchant ships over to Normandy. He says, and they wore a flash on their shoulder, seaborne. And also, not seen in that photo, they wore a brassard with RN. Now, bearing in mind quite a few of these men were veterans of the First World War. Some Navy, some Army, some Royal Flying Corps. But imagine, you could have someone who served in the Army in the First World War, now an observer, wearing an RAF uniform, and they were seconded into the Navy with the rank of Chief Petty Officer. So a bit of a real mix-up. And unfortunately we lost two. Observers Bancroft and Observer Salter were sunk with their ships. But up until very recently we still had seaborne survivors. I had a very good friend, one who lived in York. I met him in the mid-80s and we were best friends from then on. Really, really nice bloke. So I'm getting towards the end of my sort of part one of Observer Corps. But I've got to go to 13th of June 1944, which obviously just after D-Day. And there was an instruction sent out to look for strange aircraft. And the reporting word for this strange aircraft was diver. And this was the V-1 flying bomb. And the first one was spotted at Dymchurch Post by a shopkeeper and a bank clerk. Observers Rate and Observers Woodland. And of course nobody had seen one or heard one before, and they reported that it was quite easy to identify. It was flying at about 1,000 feet, with long straight parallel edged wings, and it sounded like an old Ford trying to climb up a steep hill. So that was the first report of a V-1 flying bomb. And that was about it, really. The rest of the war was pretty quiet. Didn't get many Germans coming flying over after that. So got to 1945 and we were stood down. But that isn't the end of the story, because there was a couple of blokes over in the east who were getting a bit naughty, and people were starting to throw buckets of instant sunshine around, and they thought, oh, things are getting a bit dodgy again. We'll bring the Observer Corps back. So in 1947 we were stood to again. But that's another story, which I'll keep for another time. That's if you're interested, of course, because I don't want to waffle on if you're not interested. But I can go through the nuclear reporting role and how posts were built, manned, and what would have happened through a nuclear attack, which is something I do in my talks. So I'll have a look at the chat in a minute, and if you have any questions, fire away, or come on the stream and fire away. But that's me for now. So I hope I haven't bored you too much, and I hope you haven't fallen asleep. M5TXJ.